Honor guard. Attain. Hit. Port. Arms. Half right. Peace. Unlock. Rifles. Prepare to fire. Ready. Aim. Fire. Ready. Aim. Fire. Ready. Aim. Fire. Lock. Rifle. Half left. Peace. Present. Arms. Bugler. Sound taps.
That fucking shit stinks. I don't want to pull rank, Cleon, but if you don't get rid of that fucking head...
I don't hear nobody else complaining but you.
Well, maybe you should listen to your team.
Medical advice, Cleon. You dump that shit.
Hey, Doc, shut the fuck up. You don't know shit.
Fuck you, man. It stinks like a sack full of assholes.
Chapter 3. Hill 875. The first time Dominick Montiglio was ever in an airplane, he jumped out. And what a glorious feeling it was when his parachute popped and he was just a kid's balloon floating in the pillowy sky above Fort Benning, Georgia. He yelled like he was back on Coney Island. Airborne! Airborne! Beside him, other recruits floated down too. He had passed basic and advanced infantry training and was in airborne ranger school, the third leg of his quest for a Green Beret. The spontaneity of his enlistment aside, he was on a mission to prove himself right and Nino wrong. He was immune to the era's budding anti-war movement. His new buddies were the same. Soldiers in other units had begun greeting each other with the word peace, not rangers. They said war. When they sang ranger songs on long humps across Georgia's clay plains, it was with fervor generals dream about. I want to be an airborne ranger. I want to live the life of danger. The reward at the end of those humps was having to recite the Ranger Creed while bellying through a trench 100 yards long and full of excrement, mud, and garbage. I accept the fact that as a Ranger, my country expects me to move farther, faster, and fight harder than any other soldier. Readily will I display the intestinal fortitude required to fight on to the Ranger objective and complete the mission, though I be the lone survivor. Though I be the lone survivor was the phrase Dominick began quoting to people back home. After 77 days of physical torture and mental abuse, the formerly chunky boy from Brooklyn, by way of Levittown, graduated Ranger School with a lean, hard body, a supremely confident attitude, and a 2-pack-a-day camel habit. His buddies named him Stubby because he was only 5 feet 8 but strong as a tree trunk. Next came the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. He learned how to throw a hatchet and to use 267 other instruments of death, from garrotes to 50 caliber machine guns. He was cross-trained in 2 specialties, light weapons and silent warfare. When he finally got his Green Beret, he was a land-based stealth fighter. Unaccompanied by any members of the Gaggi family, The Montiglio family saw him off at an airport in New Jersey the day he left for South Vietnam. The goodbye had a double-edged poignancy because his mother Marie had recently been diagnosed as having Hodgkin's disease, a cancer for which treatment was then limited. Her doctors had told her she might live several more years, or only a few. It was impossible to tell. "You can't die before I do," she told her son. "Though I be the lone survivor, Mom," he said. "Promise." At the time, counterinsurgency was the primary Green Beret mission. They parachuted into enemy territory to blow up convoys, capture prisoners, and spread disinformation. On one such mission, 2 months after he arrived, Dominick saved a life and, so far as he knew, took one for the first time. As he ran to a helicopter extraction, a beret behind him was wounded by a sniper. He turned and saw the sniper racing toward the man to finish him off. He ran back, shot the enemy dead, and carried his comrade away. The man survived, and Dominick won his first medal, a Silver Star. Later, he won a Bronze Star for saving a patrol from an ambush and helping to destroy a machine gun nest while under heavy fire. A writer heard about it and called him a rawhide rough hero in a magazine story picked up by a newspaper back home. The more combat he saw, however, the less the medals meant. The only medal he wore without unease was his combat infantryman's badge, because it was awarded for being under fire 30 straight days. To him, it was a greater measure of bravery than a single feat. He survived his tour, then volunteered for special patrol duty with the 173rd Airborne Brigade, his home unit. Patrol members were known as LRPs, a twist on the acronym for their specialty, Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol. As a Green Beret, he had done the same kind of hide-and-seek soldiering as the LRPs. He became close to his LRP team's 5 other members, and after surviving a second tour, volunteered for a third to be with them. Home on leave, he broke the news to his mother, but she did not complain because he also said he intended to make a career of the Army and stay in at least 20 years. In the shadow of her terminal illness, she found more peace of mind in him going back to war than worrying about him drifting toward Nino's world once Hodgkin's disease finally claimed her. Nino, of course, was appalled. "You really are an idiot," he told his nephew, "but a lucky one." Nino's barbs did not sting like before, because Dominick was certain he had won his respect. Nino might not have answered any of the 6 letters he wrote to him from Vietnam, but Dominick detected admiration in his uncle's voice when Nino probed for details about the medals and how he survived combat. Dominick would cite training, prudence, teamwork, preparation, and luck. Never the secret survival mantra he had adopted. In times of stress, when he was buried in some foxhole, hiding from the enemy or hoping the next mortar shell would land elsewhere, he would pull his poncho around like a boy hiding under the covers and, adapting an old story from Uncle Carlo, would repeat to himself over and over, "I am the lion and fox. I am the lion and the fox." In the summer of 1967, the 20-year-old sergeant left for Vietnam again. His unit was now in the central highlands of South Vietnam. In the jungle hills west of Doc Tho, some 12,000 North Vietnamese Army regulars had massed in order to seduce the U.S. forces into a fight, and late that summer the NVA got its wish. It was the worst fighting of the war so far. The NVA had rigged the hills with tunnels and bunkers, enabling them to withstand superior American firepower and mount a series of wicked artillery assaults and ground attacks. The 164-man company of the 173rd Airborne was reduced to 44. Many dead were dismembered during the artillery barrages. After one, Dominick and others who knew their friends' tattoos were ordered into mobile morgues and asked to identify body parts. The experience haunted him for days. He could not erase the images, nor his guilt for feeling relieved his arms and legs were not on display. After more skirmishes, he was awarded the Army's second highest medal, the Distinguished Service Cross, which was pinned on him during a battlefield ceremony that included a symbolic tribute to the dead, 126 empty pairs of ranger boots in neat, eerie rows. By fall, the U.S. command was certain the NVA had retreated to sanctuaries in Laos and Cambodia. In November, Dominick's 6-man LRP team was ordered to scout a hill where commanders felt an NVA remnant was protecting the retreat. The hill was on the western edge of Cambodia, and since it rose 875 meters above sea level, was known by the Army as Hill 875. LRP teams often stayed in the jungle up to 2 weeks before being helicoptered out. Their job was to get information and, if feasible, ambush enemy patrols. LRP warfare was constant tension, spiced by moments of total terror, forgetting the 100-degree temperatures, the ants, leeches, and mosquitoes, and the jungle's 131 varieties of poisonous snake, harmless until they sensed movement. Dominick was his team's point man, the one who surveyed the landscape ahead for signs of life and death. He carried a shotgun because of its wide shot pattern at close range. He looked for bushes leaning the wrong way, rocks recently overturned, trees with suspicious branches. To his teammates, he had described his skill on point as reading between the lines, a gift from his uncle Nino, about whom little else was ever said. On November 18, 1967, the patrol's 10th day on Hill 875, Dominick came around a bend in a trail and saw a series of man-made steps, short stalks of bamboo tied together with vines, running up and away from the trail, then vanishing in the bush. They appeared freshly made, and were the enemy's way of moving men and firepower up and down the hill in a hurry. Following the steps, the team soon found an empty bunker. It appeared connected to a tunnel, which probably led to caves where the enemy had hid during American bomb attacks. Dominick decided the enemy was hiding now, letting the LRPs up the hill. He said to Uncle Ben, the LRP's team leader, "They're not going to hit us. They don't fucking want to." "Not yet," Uncle Ben agreed. "Bad vibes here," said Bones, the team's radio man. Moving up, the LRPs found more empty bunkers, tunnels, and finally, an enemy base camp, recently abandoned, judging by campfire ashes. Evaluating the findings, commanders at Dak To decided the enemy had indeed kept a force on, or under the hill, to cover a retreat across the border. They ordered the 2nd Battalion of the 503rd Infantry, 1,000 men, to the foot of the hill. They were to move up in the morning and look for a fight. The LRPs were told to spend the night where they were, halfway up. At dawn, the jungle began to vibrate as preparatory shelling of bunkers, pinpointed by the LRPs, signaled the start of the assault. At 9:43 a.m., about 500 men, companies C and D of the 2nd Battalion, began moving up. The LRPs were to monitor the action from above. It was their 11th consecutive day in the bush. Dominick noticed he was running low on food and water. Bones's radio soon crackled with urgent voices. A point man for one of the assault companies had been shredded at point-blank range. When his friends went to get him, enemy gunners popped up and shot them down. Others tried advancing in greater numbers, but were pinned down and suffered heavy casualties. Company A of the 2nd Battalion, protecting the rear, was then decimated by an NVA unit that circled in behind. On Bones's radio, the LRPs heard the doomed Company A commander frantically shout that he was under fire from all sides and in danger of being overrun. They heard the stutter of automatic fire, swearing, screaming, then only static. "Holy fuck," Dominick said. "They're wasted." Down the hill, the rest of the 2nd Battalion was surrounded. Each time troops tried moving in any direction, they were mowed down. In much larger numbers than Dak To commanders anticipated, the enemy was everywhere, racing up and down steps, dashing through tunnels, and popping out of bunkers to prevent escape. They had avoided contact with the LRPs until they had something to risk dying for, hundreds of Americans in an ambush. The 2nd Battalion was squeezed into a shrinking perimeter and exposed to a mortar rain. Bodies piled up in craters. The living tried hiding under the dead. 40-man platoons became 10-man squads. 11 of 13 medics died. All 16 officers went down, 8 permanently. 10 helicopters trying to deliver ammo and evacuate the wounded were shot out of the smoky sky. The LRPs could do nothing but monitor the carnage on their radio. With the bombing and shelling between them and the battalion, they could not help. With the hill under NVA control, they could not run. They felt like prisoners, as friends were tortured in the next cell, but their lives were now on the line too. Even if able to reach Dak To without the NVA eavesdropping on captured radios, Dak To did not have a way to extract them. Choppers still flying would be trying to help the men under fire. The LRPs were stranded and, in all likelihood, also surrounded. As night fell, they moved into a thicket and laid a kill zone of defensive booby traps. The slaughter below continued several hours. When the explosions stopped, the wind carried the moaning of mangled men up to the LRP hideout. For a while, single gunshots rang out as wounded paratroopers not yet dragged to cover were executed by the NVA. After the shots died down, the wind brought the odor of burning opium, the enemy's tranquilizer. The Lerps now knew they would have a few hours of peace. A damp chill settled over Hill 875. When it came Dominick's turn to try and sleep a couple of hours, he curled up and pulled his poncho tightly around. I am the lion and the fox. I am the lion and the fox. I am the lion and the fox. The Lerps stayed in their hideout for 2 days and used the rest of their food and water. On the morning of the third day, as a ghostly blue haze draped the jungle, they heard muffled voices and clanging noises. The enemy was moving fresh troops out of the caves and down the hill, where the battle still raged. The 4th Battalion, sent in to rescue the 2nd, was also pinned down. Several more helicopters had been shot down, and wounded men were dying for lack of medical help. As enemy bugles signaled the start of more combat, Uncle Ben, the Lerp leader, called a meeting to evaluate their predicament. Without food and water, it was useless staying hidden. They had to try to escape while they had the strength to fight. Transmissions on the team's radio indicated that a force of many thousand NVA controlled the hill. The NVA could easily spare as much as a company, 200 men, just to shadow the Lerps and make sure we don't get away, Uncle Ben said. They know where we are. They know we have to move. When they hit us, we have to spread out and keep moving. Move and fire. We ain't gonna lay down for the motherfuckers. The Lerps moved out. 10 minutes down the hillside opposite the battle, they heard movement and dove for cover just as automatic fire erupted in front. Dominick heard bullets whizzing past his ears, making a clicking sound as they broke the sound barrier, and then a slapping sound as they slammed into bamboo. The Lerps scattered. One of them began firing the team's omnipotent M60 machine gun, which spewed deadly splinters of stalks and branches in all directions. Dominick looked up to another eerie sight. Enemy dead dangling upside down from trees like slaughterhouse steers. They had tied themselves to the branches so mere wounds would not fling them from their perches. Spread out, Uncle Ben shouted. Move and fire. The Lerps raced through the thickets, ducking and spraying fire. Changing directions to confuse the enemy, they ran right into them. Pumping his shotgun, Dominick pulverized several at close range. The men took turns saving each other's lives, picking off NVA who popped up behind. They ran, ducked, and fired for 40 minutes. It seemed like hours, until return fire ceased. Soaked and aching, the Lerps gathered together. The jungle was absolutely still. All the birds and animals had long since left it to the humans. From the radio, they learned another battalion was moving up their side of the hill, meaning they would soon be exposed to preparatory bombing and shelling. Uncle Ben then mapped an escape route that snaked through the worst fighting of the last few days. Low on ammo, they moved out again. Progress was slow. They slithered through an evil-smelling area defoliated by napalm, whose powdery residue penetrated their fatigues. With nightfall, they hit again. Dominick shook from oncoming dehydration. His lips were cracked and bloody. His legs felt napalmed. But his ears hurt the most because of the non-stop explosions all around the hill. He covered them with his hands as he tried digging a hole in the jungle floor with his elbows. Agonizing hours later, the noise stopped. He rolled on his back and stared at the stars, a body waiting for the coffin to be closed. At first light, shell-shocked and dying of thirst, the Lerps moved out. Dominick was down to 3 shotgun shells and a single clip in his .45 caliber handgun. They came under fire immediately. Rocket-propelled grenades exploded in the trees. Dominick saw Bones, the radio man, go down. He saw Uncle Ben run toward Bones, then fall. An NVA soldier popped up out of a bush and aimed at Dominick, but Uncle Ben popped back up and shot him dead. Dominick dove beside a tree, fired at bushes that moved, then stopped, saving his last ammo for when the enemy was upon him. When the ammo was gone, he would unfasten the machete he carried and die hand to hand like a samurai. When a seeming lull came, he realized his legs were exposed and got up to move just as a grenade exploded 5 meters behind, knocking him out instantly. Shrapnel tore into his back and legs, and a gush of air kicked his legs forward and lifted him several feet into the sky before he crashed to earth like an airborne ranger whose parachute never opened. It was November 22nd, 1967, the day before Thanksgiving. There was a military quality to Nino's life now that would have surprised his point man nephew. From the beginning, mafia bosses had organized their families along a rigid chain of command. It started at the bottom with soldiers like Nino. They formed squad-like crews that reported to capos or captains who reported to an underboss who reported to the boss. To Nino's benefit, the system was altered when Carlo became general. To appease Albert Anastasia loyalists, Carlo appointed an Anastasia protege as underboss, but limited his authority to certain crews that in time became known as the Manhattan faction. Paul Castellano, Nino's capo, answered directly to Carlo, and over the years, Carlo's brother-in-law, cousin, and longtime confidant became the de facto underboss of the family's Brooklyn faction. Nino, of course, was well positioned anyway, because he had worked for Carlo and Paul since the early 1950s. He and Paul were close friends now, too. Paul, age 52 in 1967, was godfather to Nino's son Frank. His daughter Connie was godmother to Nino's daughter Regina. Nino had recently purchased a lot on a private island in Florida, near Paul's getaway condominium in Pompano Beach, and was making plans to build a Roy-type home there. Seemingly, Nino's special relationship with Paul also boded well for the future. Although the Manhattan faction might disagree, Paul was the logical heir apparent to 67-year-old Carlo. Because of his proximity to power, Paul had the best overall perspective on the family's disparate operations. He had also proven himself an able businessman, having spun his father's pork store into a chain of butcher shops, plus a wholesale meat company that supplied most of the chickens on Brooklyn dinner tables. He was a major loan shark, too. His book, worth several $100,000, rivaled even Carlo's. All the while Dominick was in Vietnam, the Montiglios continued to visit the Gaggis in Brooklyn on Sundays, particularly after Nino's sister learned she had Hodgkin's disease. In between, there were birthdays, holidays, and special events, like Nino's wife Rose giving birth to her fourth and last child, a boy. Despite the frequency of visits, Anthony Montiglio, an inspector for the Department of Motor Vehicles facility near Levittown, had an arm's-length relationship with Nino. It was defined soon after Anthony and Marie were married. Nino asked if he could hide some money in a bank account in Anthony's name, and Anthony refused. Because he had no way to make his brother-in-law's life miserable, the way he had Anthony Santamaria's, Nino just grumbled for a while, then forgot about it. The motor vehicle inspector had developed a better relationship with his warrior stepson, but because he felt destined to lose any competition with Nino, in which the reward was Dominick's undivided loyalty and respect, he never tried to mount one. He also did not think Dominick had the will to refuse Nino a tainted favor the way he had. Nino will try to win Dominick over someday, he was always warning Marie. Overweight once, Nino was svelte and taut now. He exercised in a gym he had installed in the bunker's basement. He squeezed his own orange juice, did not eat vegetables out of a can, and still drank only wine. His world was notorious for men who, like Roy, cheated on their wives, but he was a loyal husband. He doted on his children, 3 boys and a girl, but demanded good behavior. His Cadillac and his clothes were always immaculate. His personal dress did fit the gangster stereotype. Rakish suits, ties that matched pocket squares, shoes that clicked, and a dazzling collection of watches, rings, and bracelets. With his dark eyeglasses, which changed with each suit, he sparkled. The style was so deliberately slinky that when he strolled with Rose into a status-conscious place like the 21 Club in Manhattan, where Chuck Anderson, the maitre d', was a friend and a loan shark customer, it seemed he wanted people to know he was a gangster, though no one in his family knew just how ferocious he was, because they did not know how he had incinerated the killer of Frank Scalise. Nino's temperament was still a family wonderment. One day, he was in his car on 86th Street in Bensonhurst, waiting for his brother Roy's wife to exit a delicatessen. As she did, some neighborhood teenagers whistled and hooted. She was a dark-haired version of the pretty and blonde Rose Gaggi. One of the raucous teens was Vincent Governara, a former classmate of Dominick's at Public School 200. Judging the catcalls a personal insult, Nino waded into the teens with a hammer kept under his front seat. He swung wildly several times before Governara, who was a boxer, flattened him with a nose-breaking right hook. After coming home from the hospital, the prominent vein on the left side of Nino's neck appeared ready to explode as he vowed to his brother, I'll get that punk someday. I'll kill the little motherfucker. Marie shook her head when she heard the story. The offense was so slight, the response so exaggerated. I don't want Dominick working for you when I'm gone, she told Nino during a rare departure from the normal decorum of dinners in Brooklyn. Besides the obvious reason, she had other grounds. Dominick is Americanized now. You can't control him. He won't go by your rules. All I want is for Dom to survive that silly damn war. He will, she said. In another example of family wonderment, Dominick did. Late on the day he was knocked out and severely wounded on Hill 875, 4 dazed Lerps, carrying him and Bones the radio man, staggered into a ranger camp at the base of the hill. Just when the Lerps were on the ropes, the NVA had retreated and let them slip away. Dominick woke up 2 weeks later in a military hospital, and after several more weeks of treatment, was awarded another medal. Bones recovered too. They and the others were believed to have killed at least 50 enemy fleeing down the hill. Early in 1968, still in the Army, he left Vietnam. He was to report to Fort Bragg in North Carolina next, but went home first. His mother hosted a homecoming party in Levittown. Nino, maintaining his policy of never going to Levittown, did not attend. The next day, Dominick went to Brooklyn to pay his respects. His anger at Nino's refusal to help his music career had faded in the wake of Army triumphs. He even attributed some of his success to growing up with Nino and living through dramas like the siege in the bunker during the Gangland War of 1957. Apart from Nino's tirades, Dominick had always enjoyed his company. Making people come to him was just the price Nino charged. Since Dominick had proven himself right about the Army and Nino wrong, it was easy to pay. Nino invited him to accompany him, Paul Castellano, and their wives to a stage show at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in Manhattan. Wear your uniform, your beret, and all your medals, he said. The hypocrisy was amusing, but Dominick did as ordered and marveled at the squad of Waldorf waiters who doted on his party's perfectly positioned table. He got the idea, which was true, that the Gambino family practically ran the hotel workers' union. In a few weeks, after a physical examination by an Army doctor in North Carolina, Dominick was told he would not be allowed to parachute again because of knee injuries suffered on the hill. Angrily, he made an abrupt decision, later questioned but not retracted. That's the end of the Army for me, he told the doctor. To his mother's dismay, he wound up right back in Brooklyn. With only a few months left on his enlistment, the Army assigned him to a military police unit at Fort Hamilton, a small base whose main gate was a mile from Nino's house in Bath Beach. He enjoyed his new assignment, tracking down AWOLs, rounding up drunk soldiers in Times Square, and with the bunker so nearby, began taking some of his meals there. Naturally, Nino moaned that having an MP at the dinner table was the same as having a cop, and got even more belligerent when Dominick said he intended to take the New York State Police entrance exam after the Army. I'll be upstate someplace writing speeding tickets. Bullshit, a cop is a cop. Marie Montiglio urged her son to go to college, preferably one far away. Mom, I know what you're trying to say, but don't worry, he told her. The life of Nino is not for me. Recently, Marie's disease had produced some discolored bumps on her arms, making everyone anxious about how much time she had left. Wanting to please her, Dominick searched for a college that would admit someone with lackluster high school grades and found a junior college in Miami, Florida. He announced plans to enroll there after his discharge. By appearances, Nino demonstrated only an avuncular interest in Dominick's life. He never mentioned Gambino family matters in his presence, or introduced him to Roy DeMeo or any of the men who worked for him. Uncles Carlo and Paul were always presented in a social context, such as when, at another dinner, Nino tried to get Dominick interested in Paul's handsome daughter Connie. Dominick liked Connie but felt no spark. His spark came on another occasion, when he went to Nino's for a birthday party for a cousin. Nino set the stage by inviting the family babysitter, a neighborhood girl whose father owned a bar in Manhattan. Dominick froze when he saw her sitting cross-legged on a chair in his grandmother's apartment. She was drop-dead pretty, with Cher-like black hair to her buttocks and skin the color of cafe au lait. Her brown paisley mini-dress evoked shapely dreams. He felt she belonged in a slick Italian magazine ad, draped over a red Ferrari, and he fled to the floor below, speechless. Recouping, he asked Nino, "Who is that lady?" "Our babysitter, Denise Delasanti." Denise of the Saints. A beautiful name, a beautiful girl. Why don't you go talk to her?" In a while, the former lerp gathered his courage and walked back up the steps where Denise was. He remembered little of their conversation, only that she was 17 years old, youngest of 5 daughters, and a freshman at St. John's University in Queens. Apart from beautiful, she was smart, sweet, and gentle, and her last name was so apt. Delasanti, Denise of the Saints. In 6 weeks, he asked her out. They saw a movie, then went to Nino's house for coffee. He took her home at 10:30 in the evening. She lived with her parents and had an 11 o'clock curfew. They quickly moved from dating to relationship, but did not make love. She was against it outside marriage. Dominick, head over heels, did not try to persuade her otherwise. The FBI might not know about Nino, but Denise's parents did. They knew some of his loan shark customers and were therefore neither fond of him nor his nephew. They allowed Denise to babysit only because the Gaggis lived nearby and paid her well. Dominick resented the prejudgment, but did not mention their hostility to his volatile uncle. Dominick was still in the army when Nino first asked for a tainted favor, which was cast as a matter of honor. A dentist who lived and worked in the neighborhood had made a suggestive remark to one of his patients, Rose Gaggi. Nino interpreted it virtually as attempted rape and informed Dominick he was going to plant a stick of dynamite beneath the dentist's front porch. "Insulted my wife and your aunt. This'll tell the guy he should get the fuck out of the neighborhood before he really gets hurt. We'll sneak over there tonight, you watch my back." Knowing Nino and having heard the Vincent Governara story, Dominick was less surprised by Nino's overreaction than his assumption he would help. But because a porch, not a person, was the target, he watched Nino's back. Some days after the message went off, the dentist did pack his bags and move away. Dominick never mentioned the incident to Denise and never talked about his uncle's shadowy life, except obliquely, in a language a neighborhood girl like Denise well understood. "It's funny about people in that life," he would say. "You can tell who's in it just by the way they are, but if that person is friendly and treats you well, they're just good people." Everyone liked Denise. At St. John's, a fraternity elected her Miss Mu Gamma Delta. She invited Dominick to be her date at the installation and the party following. With his close-cropped army hair, he felt out of place. People his age were adopting hippie looks and attitudes as 1968 wound down. At the party, he experienced his first Vietnam flashback. He was standing against a wall, drinking a beer, watching everyone dance, when the room exploded and body parts flew everywhere. He sank to the floor and covered his face. Denise kneeled beside him. "Are you okay? The war?" "Yeah. No, worse than that." She hugged him. "I think I'm just overwhelmed by change," he finally said. "It was so bad over there. But here I am with you and I'm so happy. It's like I was in hell and now I'm in heaven. I love you. I love you too." His eyes were moist. "You make me so happy I cried. I can't believe it. You want to dance? Whatever you want." On December 16th, 1968, Dominick was honorably discharged, but emotionally he would never leave the army. It dominated the self-portrait in his mind's eye and made him confident of his own wit, luck, and strength. His sudden meltdown at Denise's party was just an aberrant consequence of combat that would fade. Still, he began submerging some of his military identity because he also was attracted to the countercultural drumbeat of the time. He would never attend an anti-war rally, but did begin wearing long-sleeve shirts to conceal the paratrooper tattoo on his right forearm. He was filled with optimism, but except for his relationship with Denise, he would not succeed at much. He enrolled at Dade County College in Miami, but rarely attended class. He and a few similarly minded veterans spent most of their days high on LSD and listening to music in the squalor of a ghetto dive they rented. One spring day, unexpectedly, Nino and Rose showed up. They were in Florida, overseeing construction of their sumptuous winter home. Dominick was embarrassed, and he was surprised that Nino spared him a harangue on his unkempt appearance and surroundings. "Why don't you come home?" his uncle said instead, adding that he was about to buy a small Italian ices business in Brooklyn. "You can run it, as long as you cut your hair and straighten out." When Dominick telephoned his mother and mentioned the offer, she warned him away. She recalled reading somewhere that someone in that business had recently been shot dead at his desk. Only in Brooklyn can making ices get you killed, he replied, too lightly for her. That's your uncle's life, she snapped. Don't forget it. Tired of his mother's worries, Dominick came up with a new idea. In a letter to Denise, he suggested they run away together and make a new life for themselves in San Francisco. He had visited there on one of his leaves home. It was where he first saw an exciting new breeze sweeping the country, where he first felt out of step. Musically, San Francisco was also a center of innovation, and he wanted to give that part of his nature one more chance. He described it as a fairy tale land where dreams came true. When Denise said maybe, he left Florida and rented a small apartment near his parents' house in Brooklyn. Nino had filled the Italian ices job, but Dominick saw no harm in accepting another job his uncle offered. Doorman and assistant greeter at the 21 Club in Manhattan, where Nino was influential because of his relationship with Chuck Anderson, the maitre d', who owed Nino money. Dominick had met Anderson, the Mr. New York of the city's gossip columns, at parties at Nino's house. Nino had described him as a war hero whose relatives grew up with Al Capone. The 21 Club was a glittery restaurant patronized by celebrities, politicos, and old men with young women on their arms. Dominick hated it. He felt like a servant and quit after 2 months. Too many assholes, he told Nino. Nino and Paul got him membership in the Waiters Union. He hired out as a bartender at banquets and weddings, but felt like a servant again and quit after a few weekends, even though he was trying to save money for a new start in San Francisco. Nino got him another job with a small landscaping company owned by the brother of a Castellano soldier, but the work was irregular and mundane. In high school, Dominick had hustled at a McDonald's to make a few bucks, but common labor was now below his Green Beret self-esteem. Being unemployed rather than underemployed was easier on his ego. His ego kept the California fund from building too quickly and aggravated Denise's parents' opinion of him. When he indicated to them through Denise that he wished to discuss marrying her, they sent back a message, "Don't even bother." They say Michelle has to get married first, Denise reported, referring to an older sister, before they even think about letting me get married. It was Denise who proposed a solution. One night soon, as they were parked in a lover's lane along the Brooklyn shoreline, she said, "We don't need anyone's permission. Let's elope." Dominick happily agreed and suggested they leave immediately and get married somewhere along the way to California. "No, we have to do it before we leave. If we leave together, we'll sleep together, and I want to be married first." "Let's do it then. I'm dying to get out of Brooklyn." 18-year-old Denise had been charmed by his depiction of San Francisco. She had more flower child in her than he. She was ready to take a break from college. Her grades were superior. She could go back any time. "California, here we come," she cried. The couple got a marriage license and confided their plans to Marie Montiglio, who was elated. She urged them to make her a grandmother right away and volunteered to speak on their behalf to Denise's parents. "Don't bother, it won't do any good," Denise said. Without Denise's parents okay, the pastor at St. Finbar's in Bath Beach refused to officiate. So did the pastor of the Montiglio parish in Levittown. The couple randomly visited a Protestant church near Levittown. The minister married them the next day, January 19, 1971. After the newlyweds broke the news to everyone else, Dominick's mother hosted a reception in Levittown. All the Montiglios were in a gay mood. Denise's parents appeared funereal. Nino refused to come because Dominick had not informed him beforehand. Once in San Francisco, Dominick and Denise discovered they could not afford the city's rents and had to settle for nearby Berkeley. Still, they quickly exhausted their meager funds. But just when they were thinking of coming home, the owner of their apartment building offered Dominick a job as the building superintendent. It came with free rent, and Dominick could do the work just about when he pleased. He and Denise made love, did drugs, went to concerts, explored Northern California. For a year, they had their fairy tale life. Denise was an incredible partner, strong, loyal, and supportive to the point of selflessness. Deciding they could use more money than he made as a building super, she took a job as a supermarket checkout clerk and continued to keep her own education on hold when he began attending Merritt College in Oakland as a full-time music student. His interest had turned to jazz, and she bought him a $1,200 saxophone. He quickly became skilled on the sax, and he and 4 other students formed a group, the Brooklyn Backstreet Blues Band. All became interested in a new sound, fusion, a marriage of jazz and rock. Frank Zappa came to one of their sessions at a school seminar and encouraged them to record a demo tape. The result was astounding. Their compositions roared and sailed in many directions, yet held on to unifying themes. It was intricately plotted music, but raucous and chaotic, like combat. The Backstreet Brooklyn Blues Band sent their tape to all the record companies and waited and waited. These assholes say it's too avant-garde, Dominick bitterly complained to Denise. We ain't marketable. We ain't Frankie Valli. Marie and Anthony Montiglio and their children Steve and Michelle arrived for a visit in the summer of 1972. Marie used almost all her home movie camera film on landscapes along the way. Arriving in Berkeley, Anthony took over the camera. The movie, the last in the Montiglio family collection, ended with Marie, two fingers of her right hand crossed in a gesture of hope, knocking on the door of her son's apartment. Marie's health had declined significantly, but nothing was said for fear of scaring the children. Dominick's boss gave the visitors keys to a furnished apartment, and they wound up staying 6 weeks. Between Marie's illness and Dominick's disappointment with another stalled music career, it was a bittersweet time. After the Montiglios left, Dominick and Denise went to see the new hit film The Godfather. Inevitably, he identified with the character Michael Corleone, the Mafia Don's youngest son, a war hero who first appears in the movie wearing a military uniform. The character's family and relationship dilemmas were instantly familiar. The heroic way he becomes like his father and takes command of what is portrayed as a dark but peculiarly noble world was an irresistibly appealing fantasy. It wasn't about gangsters, Dominick solemnly told Denise on the way home. It was about family. Within days, the couple made 2 major decisions: to try and make a baby and to return to New York, where they found an apartment near his dying mother's house. Dominick's Brooklyn Backstreet Blues Band tape and his saxophone went into storage with his 4 Directions memorabilia and Vietnam medals. Later, he went to St. Finbar's in Bath Beach for the first time in a long while and became godfather to Nino's youngest child, a boy named Michael. In December 1972, Marie Montiglio entered a hospital. She hung on several weeks. "I will not die until my first grandchild is born," she told Dominick before, at age 52, she slipped away. That same day, too late to tell her mother-in-law, Denise learned from her doctor that she was pregnant. Having prepared for the bad news, Dominick tried concentrating on the good, but it was impossible. He had never felt life's cycle of pain and beauty more profoundly. Marie was laid out at the Cusimano and Russo funeral home in Bensonhurst. The first night of the wake, after everyone left, a gaunt man with drinker's eyes came in by himself. Mortician Joseph Cusimano tried to shoo him away. "Please," the man said. "I used to be married to her." "What's your name?" "Santa Maria. Anthony Santa Maria." "Sorry, we're closed. Come back tomorrow night." Early the next night, Cusimano told Dominick a bum claiming to be Marie's first husband had come by. "Says his name is Santa Maria." "If he comes back, let him in," said Dominick. Since coming home, he had extracted a few more details of his parents' breakup from his mother. These made him want to hear his father's side of the story, but he had put off looking him up. On the last night of his mother's wake, he waited until everyone left, and then some more. But no more mourners came by, not until after he left too. Former Army Air Corps boxing champ Anthony Santa Maria came in a few minutes later, and Cusimano led him to the casket, where he stood silently for several minutes. "Thank you," he said, then shuffled away, back to a sister's house in North Brooklyn. Hearing about it the next day, Dominick wondered if his father hid in the shadows until he left, because he wanted to mourn in private, or because his son used to cross the street to avoid him. He was denied any answer because his father was soon found frozen to death next to a pile of cardboard in an empty lot. His sister buried him without telling his son. "He just decided to lay down and die of a broken heart," she told her friends. Marie Montiglio's death created a wrinkle for the Gaggi family. The deed to the bunker had been placed in her name in 1943. No other owners were ever added. That meant her husband had the strongest legal claim on the property, but he never raised the issue. Officially, Marie died without any assets. Even so, the deed was a problem if the Gaggis ever wanted to sell the house. As his sister lay dying, Nino had promised to look after her children, Stephen and Michelle. Dominick, he said, was a big boy who would take care of himself. Let him, she said. A few days after the funeral, however, Nino asked Dominick his plans. Dominick said he and Denise were returning to California to have their baby and another go at a music career. He said it without much conviction. Nino said a father-to-be could not afford any more drift. I'm buying a car service. You could run it for me, he said. Private car services were a booming business in New York, thanks to the declining state of subways and the practical unavailability of taxis in any borough but Manhattan. It's time to settle down, Nino said. You belong here in Brooklyn. 25-year-old Dominick asked for time to think. Replaying the conversation in his mind, it was hard not to compare himself to Michael Corleone and Nino to Vito, Michael's father. Fantasy aside, the car service was a legal business venture. It was a job with some dignity. On the other hand, California was a cloudy picture. His rent-free deal was gone. His band had broken up. Once Dominick made all his rationalizations, only his dead mother's wishes stood in the way. But he told Denise it was possible to work for Nino without getting too deep into that life. Denise had accepted the inevitability of this moment since his romantic assessment of The Godfather. Her parents had opposed marriage because he might turn out like his uncle, but she had married him and loved him deeply. In her 21-year-old mind, Dominick could be a rogue but not a criminal. A week later, he accepted Nino's job. Miss Mu Gamma Delta accepted a full-time role as wife and mother and never returned to school. Pleased, Nino asked, "Where are you going to live? You can't stay in Levittown. Why don't you move in here?" The top floor of the Gaggi house was open. Denise liked the idea. It was a large apartment. She had spent many nights in it babysitting and had met her husband a few steps below. Early in 1973, they moved in. He had begun life on the bottom floor, moved to the middle when his father left, and now, after his mother's death, was on the top, back home in the bunker. Nino gave him $200 a week to manage the car service, but deducted $165 a month as rent. Dominick was miffed. His mother had helped pay off the mortgage on the bunker, but accepted it as another example of Nino's confounding ways. He gave with one hand and took with another. Nino also purchased the couple furniture worth $2,000, but docked Dominick's salary $75 a week to pay for it. Denise delivered a baby girl on August 1st, 1973. She and her husband wanted to honor his late mother, but thought it might be bad luck to name the infant Marie. They decided on Ka-Marie, the Ka having no special meaning, but making for a pretty name. Not then and not ever did Nino sit Dominick down and explain the outline of his world. He never gave a speech about Carlo Gambino controlling an empire through crews of soldiers, led by captains and capos reporting to an underboss. He merely pulled back a curtain, a little at a time. Once in a while, however, he would quote lines from his favorite movie, The Godfather. His favorite was the ailing Don's speech as he passed the torch to son Michael. "I don't regret my life. I refuse to be a fool dancing on a string held by all those big shots. I don't apologize." "That's me," Nino would say. "I don't apologize." Chapter 4. Swing of Things. Lingering in the amber light near the entrance to Villa Borghese, the restaurant on the corner, Anthony Gaggi appeared to be waiting for dinner companions. Some passers-by, neighborhood people in the know, might have speculated he was a gambler debating whether to return and chase his losses at the craps game underway in a house one door away. No one was aware how dangerous it was just being near him. It was minutes before midnight, March 2nd, 1975, 2 years after Marie Montiglio's death. Nino occupied the northwest corner of 20th and Bath Avenues in Bath Beach. A block west on Bath, the shift was changing at the New York Police Department's 62nd Precinct Station House, the 6-2. Nino was 2 blocks from home and close to settling an old score. On 20th, at the corner, he saw a maroon Plymouth. Inside, a small dot of light snaked across the windshield. A man was barely visible on the front seat. Nino was pleased. The job was underway. Then he noticed the car was illegally parked by a hydrant, making it an easy mark for quota-filling, shift-ending cops from the 6-2. His pulse quickening with his overlooked wrinkle, he peered beyond the car, expecting to see his normally reliable partner, Roy DeMeo. But Roy was nowhere in sight. Nino grew more agitated. Roy was the job's rear sentry. If strangers came along that way, he was to tap on the Plymouth's trunk and warn the man inside to douse his penlight and duck down, the same as Nino's role at the front. The man inside was placing an explosive device under the front seat and rigging it to the driver's side door. The car belonged to a small-time craps player, Vincent Governara, the teenage boxer who broke Nino's nose after Nino tried to assault him and his friends with a hammer because they rudely admired a pretty woman, Nino's sister-in-law, 12 years ago. Tonight, Nino was tying up a loose end in his ordered life, making good on a vow. I'll get that fucking punk someday. His embarrassment and defeat at the hands of a neighborhood teen were blemishes in his morning mirror. He never doubted he would remove them when the time came, and finally it had. After the fight, Governara's family had moved away. A few months ago, however, one of Nino's men, aware of his leader's grudge, saw Governara driving in the neighborhood. He tried following to find where he lived, but lost him in traffic. En route to Nino's this night, the man had spotted the Plymouth again, parked 2 blocks away. Governara had come to Nino. But where was Roy? Nino's telltale neck vein bulged. Shaking down pornography distributor Paul Rothenberg and then murdering him to protect Nino and himself from exposure. Roy had been effective and ruthless, a good partner to have. But lately, as the worst of his fears came true and the IRS began investigating his fairy tale tax returns, Roy had grown jittery and started taking Valium. Nino, who shunned even aspirin, had scoffed that an IRS investigation was just a board game played by lawyers, but Roy refilled his prescription. Nino now concluded that Roy was panicking again, worried the man in the car might make a mistake and blow them all up. He had wandered into the Villa Borghese on the pretense Governara might be inside, eating a late dinner. Roy was watching out for himself and exposing his partners to detection. The shadowy figure of a man, too slim for Roy, suddenly appeared on the sidewalk. He was just a passerby, approaching the car from behind. Nino began to move forward, to tap on the hood, and warn the man inside to duck down, but saw he was going to be too late. The man in the car, his work over, was sliding across the front seat toward the passenger door. He opened it and stepped out just as the passerby strolled by. For an instant, the men were face to face, but the passerby quickly averted his eyes and moved on, a wise way to be in Brooklyn, according to legend. If called as a witness, he would not have been able to identify the man he saw leaving the car, Dominick Montiglio. Dominick had told his wife it was possible to work for Nino without getting too deep into that life. But here he was, at age 27, hitting bottom. This time he was helping blow up a person, not a porch. In the minds of Nino and Roy, however, he was merely opening the door to the clubhouse, making his debut. Murder was just his final rite of passage. Heart racing, he joined Nino on the corner and angrily whispered, "Where the fuck was Roy? The fucking guy dogged it." On the heel of these words, Roy emerged from the restaurant. "Where the fuck you been?" Nino demanded. "Making sure the kid wasn't in there." "Fuck you, the guy eats at White Castle. He ain't anywhere but the crap game. Some guy got up in Dom's face 'cause of you." Roy offered to make amends, show power. "All right, so let's go get that guy. Fuck you, let's get out of here." Roy resented the implication that he had been cowardly. He thought he had acted smartly. It was dumb to stand behind a car while someone inside played around with a grenade. Here he was trying to help Nino get his revenge, and all he got was grief. Nobody was going to bother that car. This is Brooklyn. The men walked to Nino's house and waited on the front stoop for an explosion. Dominick had inserted toothpicks in the locks of the car's other doors, so Governara would have only one to open. And on the inside pull-up lock of that, he had tied string connected by fishhooks to the grenade's pin. He was certain of an explosion, but not a fatal one. It was a concussion grenade, meaning it did not spew shrapnel like a fragmentation grenade. The plastic housing of its black powder charge melted on detonation. To accomplish its purpose, the shattering of brains, a concussion grenade was ideally used in a confined area, like a Hill 875 tunnel. When the guy opens the door, the energy has a way out, he had told Nino and Roy. He might break his neck against the ceiling, but he might just get knocked out. Grenade came from Roy's arsenal of weapons, now hidden in the Gemini Lounge basement. Roy, saying he knew just as much about weapons as Dominick, insisted it would work. Since meeting him 18 months earlier, Roy also had frequently ridiculed Dominick's combat experience and all his Green Beret bullshit. Once he broke into a mocking sing-song, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli." "Roy," Dominick pointed out, "that's the Marines, not the Army." Roy had never mentioned chubby DeMeo to Dominick. About the grenade, Roy had bitingly said, "It'll work. This ain't no Vietnam. This ain't like over there in Vietnam." About 1 o'clock in the morning, with all still quiet, Roy left for his Massapequa Park home, his Valium, and a stiff cutty. If IRS investigators had interviewed his neighbors, they might have learned that at various times he told them he worked in the used car business, the construction field, and food retailing. He never mentioned the Borough of Brooklyn Credit Union, where he was now president of the board of directors, or the S&C Sportswear Corporation, a Brooklyn company that listed him as an employee. Naturally, he never mentioned the Gambino mafia family, where much to his chagrin, he was still an associate, not a made man. Alone with Dominick, Nino said, "Don't ever forget what Roy did tonight." "How could I? He left me in a bad spot." "Like they say in the Army, he left his post. Don't ever forget that." Dominick felt a chill, not from the words, but an uninvited thought. What if Governara did not leave the game until morning? Public School 200 was a block away. Kids would be passing by, like he and Governara were 20 years ago, when they were classmates, waving to 6'2" cops. In their haste to kill, the plotters had been insanely reckless. The former lerp braced himself because he knew what thought would come next. More regularly now, violent images from Vietnam darted equally uninvited into his consciousness. One particular flashback kept recurring. In it, he saw himself picking up heads, arms, legs, and intestines that slipped through his fingers as he sought to piece soldiers together. And now, in the dark with Nino, he flashed on little heads, arms, and legs, and sank down on the stoop before he fainted. "Everything okay?" Nino said. "Just a little tired." "Me too. I'm going in." Alone now, Dominick decided to stay up and, if no explosion occurred by daybreak, remove the grenade. He had 4 seconds to repin it once he opened the door. More time could be bought by breaking a window and entering the car that way. Somehow it could be done. He was growing accustomed to sleepless nights because he had also begun having nightmares. A recurring picture from these had been that of an artillery shell drilling a basketball-sized hole through his chest. One night he awoke with such pain that he went to a hospital certain he was dying of a heart attack. The nightmares had gotten worse over the last year, and a few months ago he had finally sought help from the Veterans Administration. A doctor prescribed the same drug Roy was taking, Valium, then wrote, "This veteran is suffering moderate to severe emotional reactions from his battle experiences in Vietnam. Since his separation from the Army, he has functioned significantly below the level of a person of his intelligence and previous performance. This pattern is quite the opposite of that which prevailed prior to combat, when he was active in sports, led his own musical group, and had an active social life. His nightmares duplicate actual events he was involved in." Delayed stress syndrome was the term used to describe the emotional turmoil many veterans experienced after coming home to a divided country whose politics reduced them to pawns, losers, or savages. Dominick did not see a connection between his stress and working for Nino. Veterans who led Boy Scout troops suffered similarly. It was just another way his life had changed since he began managing Nino's car service. The Plaza Car Service took part of its name from the shopping center where it was located. Kings Plaza, the first suburban-style mall in Brooklyn, was on the southern edge of Flatlands and was that community's, and Canarसी's, principal shopping district. At the car service office in 1973, Dominick met Roy DeMeo for the first time. Roy arrived with Nino, who came by twice a day to count his dollars. Nino introduced Roy as a friend, but Dominick knew that if Roy was truly Nino's friend, he would have met him earlier. Roy was clearly younger than Nino and also plainly deferential. Reading between the lines, he sized Roy up as a Gambino family partner of some kind. Where Uncle Nino was disciplined in speech and appearance, Roy was an immediate gabber, and his knit shirt also hung outside his trousers in a still-failing attempt to downplay an abdominal tire. Relationship-conscious Roy chattered away. In a few minutes, Dominick knew where Roy grew up, where he lived, his kids' names, and that he had recently survived an automobile accident in which a woman was killed. And that on another occasion, driving home, he saw another accident and had stopped his car and assisted one of the injured drivers. That guy turned out to be an FBI agent. Can you believe it? Me helping an FBI agent? If it had been an IRS guy, I would have let him bleed to death. Roy also asked Dominick many questions about Vietnam. Not so much the war, but the weapons. Do they really have scopes that see in the night now? Roy asked. Sure, Dominick said. I used them on point. Roy invited Dominick to visit the Gemini Lounge, the renamed bar he secretly owned in Flatlands. Good people there, he said, using code words Dominick well knew. Roy has a bunch of kids around him, Nino said later. Real sleepers. Sleepers? They look about 12 years old, but they're tough guys. In a few weeks, when Nino took him to the Gemini Lounge for the first time, Dominick met the first of Roy's sleepers. But at 5'5", long-haired Chris Rosenberg did not appear that tough. Roy introduced him as a friend in the car business, and while Roy and Nino huddled, the younger men talked. Chris was cocky and ebullient. He said he had been with Roy since he was 16. He was now 23. His man Roy was a major loan shark, although not as big as your man Nino. He borrowed money from Roy at 0.75% interest and loaned it out to his own customers at 3 to 5 points a week. His customers were mechanics and body and fender men in Canarsie and Flatlands, where he owned an auto repair shop. Need a car? He asked Dominick. I can get you a good deal on a Lincoln, 1973, great shape. At the time, Dominick owned a Jeep he bought in California. On the way home, he mentioned Chris's proposal to Nino. I don't want you to buy a car from Chris. It might be stolen. Chris and his friends deal in stolen cars. Because Chris was with Roy and Roy was with Nino, Dominick concluded that Nino profited from stolen cars too, if only as a shareholder in Roy's operation. He took silent satisfaction in remembering that as a child he had suspected that Nino, when he owned a used car lot, was somehow making money off stolen cars. Nino, driving his third new Cadillac since Dominick came home from California, told Dominick a friend of his would give him a good price and favorable financing on a new car. The friend was a loan customer who owned a General Motors dealership in Brooklyn. Soon Dominick was driving a new Oldsmobile Cutlass. In a few weeks, Nino gave Dominick a $50 raise on the condition he start picking up the weekly payment of a loan customer in Manhattan. So on Friday afternoons, Dominick began taking a few hours off from the car service and going to a familiar place, the 21 Club, to see Chuck Anderson, Mr. New York. Anderson greeted him at a new level of respect, but never said why he owed Mr. Bath Beach $25,000. In 1974, Nino folded Plaza Car Service because the profit was not worth the bother. Staying on Nino's payroll, Dominick agreed to pick up his other loans, but not for any additional salary. It's easy work, Nino said. Nino's customers were not repairmen or unreliable junkies, gamblers and street criminals. Mostly, they were otherwise legitimate businessmen who had found themselves with too many accounts payable. The developer of a dinner theater in suburban Westchester County, a few miles north of the Bronx, was a good example. He failed in a public offering of stock shares to raise the cash to complete construction of the Westchester Premier Theater in Tarrytown. For their agreements to perform, the developer then sold bargain shares with options to several entertainers, including Steve Lawrence, Edie Gourmet, and Alan King. Still, construction overruns at the 3,500-seat theater left him short. A major investor, a connected Californian, contacted Carlo Gambino, who agreed to loan $100,000, which still was not enough. Another investor, the nephew of a Gambino captain who lived in Westchester County, then asked Nino to meet him at the theater to discuss another loan. Exposing Dominick to his first big Gambino family business deal, Nino asked Dominick to accompany him. The second investor, Gregory De Palma, asked for a $250,000 loan. A little steep, Nino said, but I'll talk it over with Paul. A week later, he called Dominick downstairs to his basement office in the bunker and handed him a brown paper bag. There was $125,000 in there, half of what they wanted. Take it to Greg De Palma. And you'll be going up there every week now to get the VIG, $1,500. Make sure they don't try and cheat. Collecting the weekly interest, Dominick learned that Nino and Paul were equal partners in the loan and were gambling that the entertainers scheduled to appear would keep the house packed, enabling the developer to meet his weekly payments and pay off his loans with them and Carlo. The theater opened in 1974 with Diana Ross as the attraction, but the week ended as a loss because the Dream Girl had cost too much, $250,000. We're right back in a hole, De Palma told Dominick. The theater's California investor contacted a friend who was a childhood friend of Frank Sinatra, who agreed to a week of concerts for $125,000. Sinatra grew up across the Hudson River from New York in Hoboken, New Jersey, then a community much like the Lower East Side when Nino was growing up. He developed his act in New York clubs, and like Rocky Graziano and Jake LaMotta, was a cultural hero to Italian Americans. A Sinatra performance in New York was a special event. Carlo, Paul, Nino, Dominick, and their wives, and many other mafia-connected men, attended Sinatra's opening night. Nino also brought his willful mother, Mary, and all ate a pre-show dinner in the theater's VIP room. With their connections, they were assured the best stage front seats. New York Governor Hugh Carey occupied their adjoining table, and backstage everyone had their picture taken with Sinatra. Ominously, however, even Sinatra's concerts were unprofitable. Even so, wanting to protect his, Paul's, and Nino's investments, Carlo approved another $75,000 loan. Nino gave the cash to Dominick, who took it to De Palma. The VIG's going to be $2,000 a week now, Nino said. In the meantime, when the new models came out, Dominick got another Cutlass because Nino got another Cadillac. He kept the car, and himself now, washed and waxed at all times. He was meeting substantial people and representing Nino, so he tried to look substantial. He had shorn his long hair and tossed all the ridiculous hippie outfits he owned. He was now a more manly rendition of his old Four Directions look, polished, swarthy, and with his high, strong cheekbones and wide, powerful jawline, handsome in a rugged way. Once again, he had demonstrated, as his high school friends once noted, an uncanny knack for completely changing his outward appearance. Inside, he was feeling special again, too. He was getting into the swing of things as a top assistant to one of the important men. Denise liked the new Dominick. She did not want to know any details, however, and he did not tell her many. As the months went by, Nino kept opening the window on his world. Despite all he saw and heard growing up with Nino, despite the dynamite beneath the dentist's porch, Dominick only now began to appreciate what a dangerous man his uncle was. A telling moment came when Nino recalled his encounter with Dominick's former classmate, Vincent Governara, the teenage boxer who left Nino in the middle of 86th Street with a broken nose. Even telling the story, Nino seethed. The day that happened, I promised myself, I will get that punk someday. I will kill that little motherfucker. Why not just give him a good beating? Some things cost a little more. When Nino and Rose left for a long stay at their now complete luxurious Florida getaway, Dominick needed a place to stash all the cash he was collecting. Beneath a chest of drawers in his bunker apartment, he made a trap. In a few weeks, it contained $60,000. One night, Nino called and told him to fly to Florida with $20,000. Two robbers had accosted Nino and Rose in their retreat and taken all their cash. The robbers got away, but not without another demonstration of Nino's raging bull nature. The robbers believed the house was unoccupied, but rang the bell to be sure. When Rose opened the door, one wanted to leave, but the other pulled a gun and pushed his way inside. When Nino came to investigate, the robber without the gun yelled to the other, "Let's get the fuck out of here." "Who the fuck are you assholes?" Nino screamed. "Shut the fuck up," the gunman shouted back. "Fuck you, get the fuck out of my house." Unarmed, Nino rushed forward, but the gunman smacked him in the face with a pistol, then hammered the top of his head. Nino keeled over, incapacitated and bleeding. Rose tended to him while the robbers rifled the house. Hearing Nino tell the story, and seeing his eyes as cold and focused as they were when he spoke of Governara, "Judge a man by his eyes," Nino liked to say. "The eyes don't lie." Dominick was certain the robbers were dead men if Nino ever learned who they were. Back in Brooklyn in 1974, the bond between Nino and Dominick grew stronger. The more Nino talked about the past, especially about Frank Salisi, the more Dominick began to feel like a descendant of a royal, if renegade, family. Frank Scalisi was the finest man I ever met, Nino said. He was there with Luciano at the beginning of all this. Him and his brother Joe. They were two of the shooters on the St. Valentine's hits in Chicago. Capone used out-of-town talent on that, you know. For the first time, Dominick thought of his lineage this way. Luciano, Scalisi, Gaggi, Montiglio. Didn't know our family was so famous, he said. Nino's response betrayed his own romantic notions. Growing up, all I ever wanted was to be like Frank Scalisi and to die on the street with a gun in my hand. Like Frank did. Frank wasn't carrying, he didn't have a gun. We took care of the guy who got Frank and Joe. Oh yeah? Dominick probed a little further. Nino had come to the edge of a confession, a milestone in their relationship. The guy's name was Vincent Squillanti. We surprised him in the Bronx. We shot him in the head, stuffed him in the trunk, drove to 10th Street and threw him in a furnace. The statement was so casually matter-of-fact that Dominick saw that in Nino's mind, the killing was not about murder, but evening the score, tying up a loose end. It became that way in his mind, too. Squillanti had killed 2 members of his family. Taking revenge was normal. Taking no revenge was abnormal. I'm glad you got the cocksucker, Dominick said. While continuing to pick up Nino's loans, Dominick, at his uncle's suggestion, began working occasional days at a used car lot on Long Island. The owner had a loan with Nino and Roy. It's a good business for you to learn, said Nino, the proprietor of a used car lot when he was 27, Dominick's age. With the owner of the Long Island lot and one of the employees, Dominick began attending automobile auctions in New Jersey. The cars came from new car dealers who wanted to move trade-ins off their lot. After one auction, he accompanied the owner's employee to a car repair shop in Canarsie. The shop, it turned out, was owned by a friend of Roy's protege, Chris Rosenberg. The man from the used car lot handed over blank forms as Chris's friend gave him a wad of bills. Dominick suspected Chris's friend was buying papers he could use to make phony titles and registrations. Chris confirmed this when he invited Dominick to take a look at my car collection. The collection, 5 virtually new Porsches and Mercedes, was stored on the second floor of another friend's warehouse. They're tag jobs, Chris said. Tag what? A tag job. We steal them, then change the vehicle identification number and sell them as clean cars with clean titles. How do you get the titles? There's 100 ways, Chris said. Nino and Dominick began stopping by the Gemini Lounge early on each Friday evening. Fridays, Nino said, Roy and his crew get together and slice up the money. The Gemini occupied the front half of the first floor of a dreary 2-story rectangular brick building on a corner lot in Flatlands. In a feeble attempt to mimic a chalet, a contractor had placed a slanted wooden structure over the second floor and dropped in an A-frame cutout on each side. Whoever designed the outside of the bar tried to carry out the chalet theme by painting the bricks white and choosing Bavarian-style letters for the bar's logo. The rest of the building stayed 2 shades of brown. Inside, the Gemini was like 1,000 other neighborhood bars in Brooklyn. It had a jukebox, a pinball machine, 10 worn stools by the bar, and maybe another 10 tables with red and white vinyl checkerboard coverings arrayed around a tiny platform where a small band could perform. Hanging by the bar was the famous New York Daily News front page announcing the Brooklyn Dodgers' first and only World Series victory in 1955. Roy and his crew were seated around 2 adjoining tables like a board of directors. Dominick recognized Chris and a few other of Chris's body shop friends, including the one who paid cash for blank car documents. Other faces were new and so young they appeared to belong to teenagers. Dominick was introduced to a Joey, an Anthony, a Patty, and some others he forgot. Being with Nino, Dominick was greeted respectfully. As Nino and Roy stepped away to talk, he joined the others for a drink. It became clear that Chris, Joey, Anthony, Patty, and the rest had known each other most of their lives. They seemed to communicate with grunts, glances, and hand signals, as if they were part of some secret society. But they don't look so tough to me, Sergeant Montiglio told Nino on the way home. Well, they are, and I don't want you hanging out with them. They're punks and drug users. Any contact is on a business level only. What's their business? Cars and drugs. Roy backs them. Dominick already knew Nino was profiting from stolen cars, but drugs was new. Nino had railed against people who used drugs. He had recently walked out of a movie theater when a kid across the aisle lit a joint. But here he was in business with a man who bankrolled drug dealers. Of course, Dominick had never told Nino that he had taken LSD, that he sometimes smoked marijuana, and that while in California, he had on a few occasions used a drug he really liked, if only he could afford it: cocaine. Nino's admission was another example of the incremental way he raised the window on his world. He was preparing Dominick for a specific role. He wanted to spend more time in Florida, where he had his elegant home in Golden Isles near Hallandale, plus a new issue of Loans that had already caused a launderette to fall into his hands. While away, he needed someone to collect his New York loans and, just as important, be his eyes and ears. It explained why he introduced Dominick to Roy and his crew, but did not want him to become too friendly. One day, Nino asked Dominick if he knew Anthony Santamaria had died. "I heard they found him in an empty lot somewhere. It's a good thing because I always meant to pop him someday. He treated your mom like a dog." Though now aware that Nino aggravated some of his father's problems when they lived together long ago, Dominick did not make a reply. Any attempt to disturb Nino's facts invited tension, unwise now that he was living under the same roof and had spent the last 2 years accepting the trust Nino placed in him. He was never able to fully decide whether this was a matter of inevitability, convenience, lack of character, or, even as ridiculous as it seemed, seeing himself as if he was in a fictional romantic movie. He did think himself a good case study for the question, what in his life does a man control and what is beyond him? But his answers always got too complicated and lost a daily routine and finally ceased to matter. It was now a simple fact. Nino's life was his life, and it was a strangely good sign that Nino was so sure of his faith that in his presence, Nino could discuss killing his father like the man was some sick animal. "That's all in the past now," Nino added. "You'll be carrying the torch for me someday." At the end of 1974, Dominick spotted Vincent Governara's car, tried following it but lost it in traffic. Lying to his stepdad, Anthony Montiglio, still employed at the Department of Motor Vehicles, he asked him to run a license plate check on a car that sideswiped his and took off. The plate checked to an address from which Governara had moved, but Dominick, after checking it out, told Nino he was on the case. "Good, I want to get the guy." All the time Dominick was marching toward this bend in the trail, the delayed stress of Vietnam grew worse. Some nights he would bolt out of bed with images so vivid, intestines slipping through his fingers, shells burrowing into his chest, he was afraid to close his eyes again. It became impossible for Denise to sleep with him, and finally she urged him to see a Veterans Administration doctor, which he did on December 20th, 1974. In a report, Dr. James J. Canty wrote that his patient had delayed seeking help because Green Berets were not supposed to complain. Dr. Canty wrote, "I believe this veteran underwent extensive emotional trauma during his combat duty in Vietnam, and that his life is still being very much disturbed by these experiences." Believing the nightmare is unrelated to that life, even believing, as he told Denise, that the action of that life might make the dreams go away, Dominick plunged on. On March 2nd, 1975, he saw Governara's car by the craps game next to the Villa Borghese restaurant and went home to tell Nino, who called Roy, who came by with a concussion grenade, which, Dominick warned, might not do the job because its energy might escape when Governara opened the door to his car. "If this is going to bother you, let me know now," Nino said as the three men made their plan. "You don't have to help." "No, I'll do it." "Hey, Dom, this ain't no Vietnam," Roy said. "Give me the fucking grenade." Vincent Governara left the craps game about 2 o'clock in the morning, nearly 2 hours after Dominick booby-trapped his car. Roy was en route home, Nino had gone to bed, and Dominick was sitting on Nino's porch, wondering how to remove the grenade if it did not explode by morning, when Public School 200 kids would be all around. Governara opened the driver's side door of his car and sat directly over the grenade. The fishhooks had already pulled the pin, but while inserting the key into the ignition, the intended victim left the door open. The explosion was tremendous and knocked Governara out immediately. Glass flew everywhere and the car collapsed on itself. A gush of air threw the victim up and out of the car and across the street, where he landed, breaking a leg, but otherwise all right when he came to. Dominick had been right about the concussion grenade, and he was spared dismemberment dreams featuring children. Part 2. That Life. Chapter 5. Night of Knives. Roy DeMeo's young followers thought more highly of Dominick as Roy circulated the story of the attempt on Vincent Governara's life. Until then, Dominick was someone who rode his uncle's coattails. He might have been a Green Beret once upon a time, but he was an errand boy now. They, on the other hand, were active criminals, taking chances with the law. But booby-trapping a car on a busy street 2 blocks from a cop shop was a daring feat, even if the result was unimpressive. Roy's boys also admired the intensity of Nino's desire for revenge. They were the same way and, as they would soon show, capable of settling their scores with savage fury. All of them grew up in Canarsie, a neighborhood with a chip on its shoulder. Prior to World War II, like Bath Beach, it was a resort area, but not for the wealthy. Its bawdy oceanfront amusement park, Golden City, was a playground for the most downtrodden immigrants who carried on against the backdrop of a giant flaming dump where Brooklyn deposited most of its garbage. In the marshlands near the water, squatters from Sicily and southern Italy lived in tin and tar paper shacks and survived by fishing clams and raising chickens. A trolley line from Manhattan, an hour away, made its final stop in Canarsie. It was the city's last frontier, its last open space, until the same post-war housing shortage that spawned instant mixed suburbs like Levittown ignited a building boom. Developers, however, coated Canarsie with the more urban look of adjacent flatlands, creating a grid of mostly attached brick homes and box-like apartment buildings. By 1970, about 80,000 people lived there. Mostly they were Sicilian, Southern Italian, and Eastern European Jewish immigrants, or their descendants, the clerks, mail carriers, bakers, tailors, and factory hands of New York. Many had fled changing neighborhoods to the north and northeast, Brownsville and East New York. Immigrants from the southern United States and Puerto Rico had turned those communities darker in color, and many violent clashes between old and new groups had occurred. It was especially true in Brownsville, where the mafia had great sway. In time, however, even the most die-hard Italians bailed out and relocated in Canarsie. In 1972, a good example was John Gotti, an up-and-coming member of the Gambino family's Manhattan faction, even though he lived in Brooklyn. Like the Lower East Side in the early part of the century, and Brownsville around mid-century, Canarsie in the 1970s incubated recruits for that life. Some residents still resented any authority but the family, still distrusted governments, cops, even schools. They resisted the unreality of these notions in an urban, democratic society. And so, even by 1970, fewer than half of Canarsie's Italian male students had graduated from high school. The lackluster achievement of its young did not stop Canarsians from caring about their schools when the Board of Education revealed plans in 1972 to bus 32 black grammar school students into all-white Canarsie. The Italian-American Civil Rights League, founded 2 years earlier by the boss of the Colombo Mafia family, helped lead a raucous but ultimately unsuccessful boycott. With the Arab invader blood of Sicily in their veins, some of the protesters were only a shade whiter than some of the 6- and 7-year-old black children. The protesters screamed that busing was the beginning of the end of another neighborhood for them, and this time they had nowhere to flee. The Atlantic Ocean was at their back, and blacks and Puerto Ricans were bearing down from 2 directions. To the west was flatlands, but it was built up and more expensive. Canarsians felt cut off. Then their hastily built neighborhood began falling apart. While most of their homes were built on concrete supports, driven into bedrock below porous topsoil, sidewalks and streets were not, and these quickly became so buckled and lacking in repair that Canarsie, though new, appeared badly used. The building boom unearthed evidence showing Canarsie to be unique in another way. Its dumps and marshlands were ideal sites for killers to dispose of their victims' bodies. Throughout the boom, so many remains were found at construction locations that it became an old story and the newspapers stopped writing it. Canarsie also was a graveyard for junked cars, buses, and trucks. Whole blocks were given over to scrap metal dealers and salvage operators attracted by the comparatively favorable cost of commercial real estate. In Canarsie, and to a lesser extent in Flatlands, main streets also featured, one after the other, businesses catering to every automobile need: transmission, brake, and muffler installers, engine rebuilders, custom paint and upholstery specialists, and body shops for foreign and domestic models. In the early 1970s, a fever began to sweep through this culture of cars. Because of inflation, the price of even an ordinary new car shot up several $1,000s, creating a black market demand for stolen vehicles many sought to fill. A stolen car with counterfeit papers or an altered VIN, vehicle identification number, fetched a wondrous profit, given that it cost nothing to steal. The era's economy, combined with the nature of the auto repair industry, created another black market in replacement doors, hoods, fenders, trunks, and grills. The prices that distributors charged for such parts were increasing at a faster rate than the price of new cars. By 1974, a $10,000 automobile was actually worth $20,000 in parts. This paradox, and 240% higher salaries for union auto body men in just 4 years, made a routine fender bender an expensive accident. Some insurance companies, trying to contain costs, urged auto body shops to buy used parts, and seeking to contain costs further, some of the shops began buying their parts from illegitimate suppliers, no questions asked. So-called chop shops sprouted everywhere. In garages and shops throughout Canarsie and Flatlands, men with acetylene torches turned stolen cars into profitable piles of parts. The difference between new and chop parts was substantial. A nose clip, grill, lights, and bumpers might cost $800 when ordered from a distributor, $200 if purchased from a chop shop. Auto theft became the fastest-growing crime in New York City and the nation. Besides the appeal of high profit, it was a low-risk crime requiring modest nerve and simple skills easily acquired in a body shop or gas station. New York's dense housing patterns also worked in the thief's favor. Many drivers did not have garages, and cars left on the street or in open lots and driveways were easy pickings. The city's weak fiscal condition at the time was yet another advantage. With several thousand police officers laid off, the criminal justice system focused on violent crime. When a car thief was arrested, prosecutors and judges normally plea bargained the case away to keep courthouse doors turning. 77,000 cars, a record number and 8% of the national total, were reported stolen in the city in 1974. The young men gathered around Roy DeMeo, mostly high school dropouts from Canarsie, accounted for many dozen. The key member of the group, the one closest to Roy, was Chris Rosenberg. Chris was 5'5" and would try to gouge the eyes of anyone foolish enough to remark on it. He owned many pairs of platform shoes, not only because they were fashionable in the early 1970s, but because wearing them, he walked with an obvious bounce, springing off his toes with each step, feeling as if he was elevating himself. Though short, he was wiry and strong, and would attack bigger foes wildly and suddenly after lulling them with peaceful words, a Roy DeMeo type trick. In 1974, at 23 years, with his brown, stringy, shoulder-length hair, slightly droopy mustache, flowered shirts and bell-bottom jeans, he looked like a heavy metal guitarist. In appearance, he fit into the landscape when he cruised for female company in Manhattan's Greenwich Village, a mecca for the city's young. Two things, however, separated him from the crowd: his white Corvette and the .38 caliber revolver hidden inside. Chris was not really his first name, it was Harvey, but he hated Harvey, and for that matter, Rosenberg. Calling him Harvey or Rosenberg was just as much an offense as commenting on his size. He hated being Jewish and was estranged from his parents because of it. Growing up on a Canarsie block dominated by Italians, he came to believe that Jews were weak and timid like his father. While a boy, he asked friends and family to start calling him Chris, a clean-cut, heroic name not in use on his block. And because he was such a tortured and volatile little guy, they did. It improved his self-image, but not his temperament. He was in constant trouble in school and at home, where his mother tried in vain to coax him into showing respect for his heritage. His parents were not particularly observant Jews, but did enjoy taking family vacations at Jewish resorts in the Catskills, where Chris always acted up and picked on other Jewish kids. His parents eventually gave up on Chris, their eldest child, and let him go his way. They felt blameless. Chris's younger brother was well-adjusted and a top student on his way to becoming a doctor. Chris was as smart, if not as wise, and had an enterprising entrepreneurial streak. At age 13, he was buying and selling marijuana among an older crowd that hung out at a gas station. He also had mechanical ability and learned how to repair cars inside and out. Then at age 16, at the gas station in Canarsie, he met a friendly, tough-talking man who became a father figure to him, Roy DeMeo. Roy was then only 26, living well on Long Island, but working hard on the underside of Canarsie and Flatlands, his old neighborhood. Chris knew Roy by reputation, especially as someone connected to the Lucchese Mafia men who owned Canarsie's junkyards and scrap metal lots. Chris had dreams that someday he would be in the Mafia. He knew the notion was far-fetched, because only full-blooded Italians, preferably Sicilians, were admitted. Still, you never know, he would tell friends. Idling at the station, Roy got to know Chris, who had moved from dealing in joints of marijuana to ounces. Roy liked Chris's ambition and how he bounced around with his chin out. He saw himself in Chris, a go-getter, confident of his effect on people, one way or the other. Eventually, Roy offered to loan Chris money so Chris could deal pounds of marijuana and grams of a more potent drug, hashish. Roy had tried both, but thought they were for stupid people. Roy stuck to his favorite drug, alcohol. Over the next several years, Chris became a success, by the underside standards of Canarsie. Combining his car expertise with the money made from drug dealing backed by Roy, he opened his own business, a body shop. The name he chose was baffling to most of his friends, but showed that somewhere he absorbed something about psychological dysfunction. He called it car phobia repairs. Gradually, the body shop became a way station for stolen and chopped cars. Roy provided Chris customers and connections to the junkyards, which were the illegal parts centers for the auto body shops. Roy was paternal toward Chris, and although their 10-year age difference made Big Brother a more likely type of bond, he nurtured Chris like a son and took credit for his development. Chris was the first young man to be invited out to Roy's for a barbecue, the first to go to Roy's old friend Frank Ferrangi's farm and practice shooting handguns and rifles. "I made Chris what he is, but the kid's got a knack," Roy would boast to Nino. "Why don't he get a haircut?" Nino would reply. "He looks like a fucking hippie." By 1974, to strangers, Chris was sometimes introducing himself as Chris DeMeo. He had moved into an upscale apartment in Flatlands and was buying whatever gadgets and clothes he wanted and hiring kids to wash and wax his personal cars, the Corvette plus a Porsche. Many young thieves stole cars for him, including two full-blooded Italians who had become his closest friends, Joseph Testa and Anthony Center. Chris met them when he was living in Canarsie and dealing joints. They were 19 years old in 1974, 4 years younger than he. To strangers, he sometimes introduced them as my brothers. Joey, as he was known, and Anthony were like brothers, like twins in some ways. Joey would start a sentence, Anthony would finish. They were fanatically loyal to each other. An insult to one provoked a payback from the other. They were always together and had grown up on the same Canarsie block, each in a turbulent home with a contemptuous view of the outside world's ways. Anthony dropped out of high school before Joey did, but for the most part, Joey led and Anthony followed. Joey was 2 months older and quicker on his feet, one of 9 kids born to a truck driver and his wife. He had 5 brothers, 6 counting Anthony. Joey also was more handsome. As he blossomed, he resembled the singer Frankie Avalon, except when he opened his eyes wide and broke into a wide, mocking smile, chilling to behold. As with Chris, Joey's smile came when he wanted to smash someone's face, a frequent occurrence beginning when he turned 13 and his mother died of a blood clot, leaving his father unable to cope with his brood. Growing up, mutual friends liked Anthony more than Joey, but always ran to Joey when problems arose. When Joey was 15, a 13-year-old neighbor was mugged by a knife-wielding Puerto Rican kid from East New York. The victim complained to Joey, who rounded up Anthony and a group led by Joey borrowed someone's car and spent the day searching for the assailant. "No fucking spick can come on this block with a knife," Joey screamed as the car sped away. "I'll stick the knife up his ass." A year later, after Joey dropped out and began dealing dope and stealing cars, another kid on Joey's block complained that his teacher had too unfairly smacked him for smarting off in class. Joey went to the school, waited for the teacher to leave, and beat the daylights out of him. Before completely casting his lot with Chris and Roy, Joey worked now and then as a carpenter's helper and, as Roy once had, as an apprentice butcher. He became skilled with knives, but almost died in 1973 in a knife fight in a bar with another Puerto Rican opponent. He was stabbed in the chest and suffered a collapsed lung that gave him respiratory problems for the rest of his life. Anthony, more likable than Joey but equally vicious when provoked, hunted down the Puerto Rican and nearly beat him to death with his fists. Anthony was 5'11", 2 inches taller than Joey, and a lot more powerful physically. Before following Joey into Chris's and Roy's world, he worked for his father's small debris removal business and his uncle's sanitation company. He had only one sibling, a sister. His parents were divorced when he was 8, then remarried one another when he was 14. But by then, Anthony had been left to his own devices like Chris and Joey. Anthony dazzled many neighborhood girls. Where Joey was conventionally good-looking in a Frankie Avalon way, Anthony was exotic and sensual. With his darker skin, thicker lips, and blacker hair swept back, he would have stood out less in Rome than in Canarsie. Though Joey was more dangerous, Anthony looked the part, and a few of the girls knew that he wore a tattoo of the devil on his right shoulder. Because they were together so much, frequently at the Gemini Lounge, Joey and Anthony became known as the Gemini Twins. It was a more apt nickname than people knew because, in Greek mythology, Zeus the Thunderer fathered 2 warrior sons, Castor and Pollux, and sent them on missions. Their namesakes were the twin stars of Gemini, the 3rd sign of the zodiac. As time would tell, it was not much of a stretch to think of Roy as an ill-tempered Zeus, and Joey and Anthony as his equally surly twin stars. One of Joey's younger brothers, 17-year-old Patrick, known as Patty, sometimes tagged along with Joey and Anthony. He was a dropout too, but a wizard with cars, knowing more than his brother, or Anthony, or even Chris. At 14, with money made from a deli job, he had bought a junk car, repaired and rebuilt it, and sold it for a big profit. The young Canarsie man did not fear the law or respect it. Chris had picked up his first car theft arrest in 1970. Joey got 2 the same year. Anthony already had 3, the first when he was 12 years old. Chris's case started as a felony, but was knocked down to misdemeanor with only a fine. Another case in 1971 for hashish possession was flat out dismissed, as was a case in 1972 when he was caught swiping a snowplow out of a garage. Joey and Anthony beat all their cases because they were juveniles at the time. So far, Patty had only been charged with assault, but that too had been dismissed. By the time they all assembled under Roy's wing, they were by nature and experience primed for bigger and worse things. In 1974, backed by Roy, Chris began dealing 2 recent products in the street drug market, cocaine and methaqualone, known in tablet form as Quaalude. His connection was a young pharmacist who stole the drugs, including a potent form of pure cocaine then available for medical purposes from his drugstore. One night, the pharmacist arranged a fateful meeting. He introduced Chris to his car repairman, a young Romanian immigrant named Andrei Katz. Andrei Katz was 22 years old. In Flatlands, he ran the very best foreign car service, a small shop near Chris's, for his father, a mechanic who did not speak English well. His father and mother, survivors of a World War II concentration camp, had come to Brooklyn in 1956. Andrei was not a humble, straight-laced immigrant son. He permitted customers to pay him with drugs and boasted that women instantly fell for him because his gypsy features and accent were irresistible. He swaggered as much as any native son of Brooklyn, and when Chris said he could provide spare parts for Very Best, he knew the parts were stolen. He and Chris and the Gemini twins became friends and were soon snorting cocaine together. Once they got so rowdy at Andrei's apartment that his neighbors called police, and much pharmaceutical powder went down the toilet. In the next 2 months, Andrei bought cocaine and a Porsche engine from Chris, Joey, and Anthony. In August, he bought a .38 caliber revolver from Chris and paid him $7,100 for a half interest in 11 stolen Volkswagen vans, tag jobs, according to Chris. With Chris, Joey, and Anthony as his suppliers, Andrei also began dealing cocaine himself. They all became vulnerable to one another because of the knowledge each had of the other's crimes. In September, a friend of Andrei's who had bought one of the tag jobs was stopped by police, who discovered the van was stolen. The friend led police to Andrei, who was arrested in October, but auto crime unit detectives were less interested in a single case than a possible pattern. Andrei was told he might help himself if he provided information about an organized ring. After making bail, Andre went home and fumed. Chris had done a lousy job retagging the van. The VIN plate was an obvious phony. As soon as he learned Andre was out on bail, Chris came by Very Best Foreign Car Service with Joey and Patty Testa. Andre was with his younger brother, Victor. Chris got straight to the heart of their dilemma. You better think about what you're going to say or do, or else you're going to get hurt. Fuck you, get the fuck out of my shop. I'm just telling you, watch yourself. Fuck you, I'll take care of you. The next day, Chris confronted Andre at a Canarsie stable, where Andre boarded a horse. Andre, his back against a wall of pride now, refused to bend. The problem was Chris's fault. Chris punched him in the mouth and took off. In a few more days, Andre was pulled from his pride and joy dark green Mercedes by two men, then brutally pistol-whipped, blackjacked, and left in the street. In a hospital, Andre was incoherent for 3 days. Part of his right ear was nearly severed. His face was so badly swollen, his brother and father would not let his mother see him. When finally able to speak, he told his brother that Joey and Anthony were his attackers. I will deal with it myself, he added, and I am going to testify someday against Chris. Out of the hospital, Andre began carrying the gun he bought from Chris. He stopped dating and going anywhere alone. One night, a woman he did not know called him and said a friend had told her about him and she wished to meet him. Andre, the self-anointed ladies' man, was tempted, but smelled the trap and backed out. On November 13, 1974, shortly after Andre's release, Chris was opening his garage door when a sniper opened up with an automatic rifle. Chris was hit 3 times, but luck was with him. A bullet bound for his chest became just a glancing wound when he spun around from the impact of one that struck his lower jaw and another that ripped into his right arm. He spent only a few days in a hospital, but his face was badly disfigured. Eventually, he underwent reconstructive surgery, but was not happy with the outcome. For the rest of his life, he was bitter that he had to wear a beard. The sniper fled without detection, but Chris was certain it was Andre, and he was right. Warily, the Canarsians began traveling in groups, and always with weapons. 6 days after the attack, a city jail guard walking by a car parked near the Gemini Lounge noticed a pistol in the waistband of one of 3 males seated inside, Joey, Anthony, and Patty. The 6-3 precinct sent police officer Alvin Root to investigate, and he arrested Joey and Anthony for possessing both loaded pistols and other weapons, Joey a knife, Anthony a blackjack. At this point, another hard-boiled product of Canarsie entered the drama. His name was Henry Borelli. The backyard of his home abutted the backyard of Joey's, and when Joey contacted him from jail, Henry ran right to court and got Joey and Anthony out on bail. At age 26, Henry was practically an old man compared to them. He was also married and the father of 2 girls, but the boys liked him, and he was always a guest when Joey fired up the backyard barbecue. To a lesser extent, Henry was friendly with Chris, his more immediate contemporary. Henry had actually met Roy before Chris did and was quietly jealous of the way Chris had over the years become so close to Roy. Still, Henry had kept up relations with Chris and was one of his marijuana and hashish suppliers. What impressed Joey and Anthony about Henry was that on occasion he traveled to Morocco to score the hashish. During his last trip to Casablanca, however, Henry had been arrested, fortunately while in possession of only a test amount. But the experience was so unsettling, he was released with a warning that if he came back and tried again, he would never leave. He was looking for another line of work. He was now indifferently employed at his father-in-law's car service company. Once, he had wanted to be a cop, and he had taken and passed the entrance exam. But when the city froze the hiring list during a budget crisis, he ruined any future chance with 2 arrests for petty burglary. After Joey and Anthony got out of jail and Chris got out of the hospital, they all sat down with Roy and Henry to discuss the Andre Katz situation and the weapons charges against Joey and Anthony. Roy told the boys not to worry about the latter problem. His lawyer would, and did, get them off with just another slap on the wrist, probation. But Andre was another matter. Having already told his boys that anything is possible after you kill someone, Roy did not shock them when he said, "With what he knows about the cars, he can hurt you. Just kill the fucking guy. What are you afraid of? Just whack him and get rid of the body. No body, no crime." "I ain't afraid," Chris said. "The asshole ruined my face." Joey and Anthony were not afraid either. Neither was Henry. Andre had tried to kill Chris. It was all the motive they needed. Revenge was normal. Taking no revenge was abnormal. Chris said they needed a way to entice Andre into the open. Andre was still limiting himself to his home and to his father's body shop, and traveling back and forth always with his brother. Henry, a ladies' man despite being married, said he knew an ideal lure, a pretty young woman who lived in Manhattan. They had been lovers and were still friends. Henry called the woman and asked her to visit Andre at the shop and flirt with him until the Romanian asked her out. The woman half-heartedly agreed, then backed out, and the idea was dropped for a while. Meanwhile, in January 1975, at the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, Andre identified Chris as a major car thief. Chris learned of it within days from Roy, who was tipped off by someone who came to the Gemini Lounge one evening. Without saying a word, the man stood in the shadows outside and waited for Roy, who was talking to Dominick Montiglio, to come over. Dominick was there on a collection for Nino. The men spoke about 5 minutes, then the stranger, who had curly hair and acne scars, left. "That's my hook in the district attorney's office," Roy told Dominick. "He's a cop. He gets us information on anyone we need." The hook was actually an auto crimes detective from Queens. His partner's brother was a bartender at the Gemini. He typified why Roy constantly sought relationships and why he always tried to exploit others' weaknesses. The cop liked to gamble on sports contests. Roy hooked him by telling a cousin, who now ran a bookmaking operation at the Gemini, to overlook the man's losses. It was not unusual for cops and firemen to come to the Gemini to place bets, sometimes while on duty. On the day of a big game, before betting closed, it was not unusual to see squad cars and fire trucks parked outside the Gemini. After the cop in Roy's pocket left, the proposal that Henry Borelli made, to get a pretty woman he knew to lure Andre into the open, was revived. Henry agreed to contact her again. At age 12, Babette Judith Questal had asked her friends to start calling her Judy because of a new television cartoon show starring a monkey named Babette. She was born upper middle class in Manhattan, but grew up in Long Island suburbs. She returned to Manhattan in 1970 to put a broken engagement behind her. After first living on 27th Street, she and a girlfriend moved to a 9th-floor apartment on 37th Street between Park and Madison Avenues in well-to-do Murray Hill. Her building was on the same dense block as the Polish Mission to the United Nations, around a corner from the West German Consulate in New York, and a few doors from the city home of writer William F. Buckley. Judy and her friend bought an old plaid couch and a Tiffany lamp, put candles and wicker all around, hung a poster from the musical Hair, and set about having a good time. One rainy night in 1972, Judy happened to hail one of Henry's father-in-law's car service cars. She struck up a friendship with the driver, who later introduced her to Henry, who was as casual about cheating on his wife as she was dating a married man. Judy by now had long forgotten her fiancé. At age 25, she was a club-hopping party girl with a coquettish vibrancy and a Nancy Sinatra go-go boots look. After work, she and her roommate would sleep until 10 o'clock, hit the discos until 4 in the morning, sleep a few hours, go to work, and then do it all over again. At the time, she was a secretary for the Cat's Underwear Company. Like Joey and Anthony, tall, dark, and handsome Henry presented an attractive image to the world. He was well-built and fastidious about his grooming and clothes, a natural candidate for the door of the 21 Club, and Judy jumped out of her go-go boots at the sight of him. Years later, she did not recall if they made love on their first or second date, only that it was soon after they met. Since breaking off her engagement, Judy had been daring in her choice of companions, who included some Hell's Angels, but Henry was something new and vaguely mysterious. He told her he had been imprisoned in Turkey for smuggling jewels, and once asked if she would be interested in helping him smuggle stolen emeralds from Venezuela. Henry, who had a fanciful side, was just making the most of his arrest in Casablanca, and Judy dismissed his comments as malarkey. She thought he was a harmless dreamer until one night he showed off a pistol he was carrying. Even so, she continued seeing him, but only a few months more. Between his marriage and her club life, the affair had no place to go. They agreed, however, to remain friends. Their friendship was 3 years old when Henry dropped by her apartment in March 1975 to explain in further detail what he had proposed over the telephone months earlier. Judy noticed that Agatha, her Chinese pug who usually sat in visitors' laps, was frightened by Henry and had fled the room. But she listened to what he had to say anyway. A man named Andre owed him money, Henry said, but whenever Henry tried talking to him, Andre ran away or threatened to call the police. So I just want you to go and meet this guy and make a date with him. Then I can talk to the guy about making payment. Are you sure all you want to do is talk to him? I wouldn't involve you in anything. Judy drew what she regarded as a respectable line. If you want to talk to him, I don't want to hear what you have to talk to him about, and I don't want it done in my house. No problem, Henry said, offering to buy her a gift. No, if this is a favor, it's a favor, as long as you promise you're not going to hurt him. Henry promised. 2 months, and the attempted murder of Vincent Governaro went by. Judy got telephone calls from Henry saying the matter was pending and to stay available. Then, in May of 1975, Andre upped the ante by testifying before a Brooklyn grand jury and spilling secrets about not only Chris but Roy as well. As with all grand jury testimony, it was supposed to stay a secret, but Roy got another visit from his hook, and Dominick arrived just as the crooked detective left. When it came to the process of law, Roy liked to make it appear he knew as much as his famous lawyer uncle, and so Dominick heard Roy tell Chris that a grand jury investigation added up to nothing. However, if the case proceeded to trial and Andre testified again, they had problems. We got to take this guy out, Roy added. He's got to go right away. In the first week of June, Henry called Judy to say he needed his favor now. Do I really have to do this? She asked. Yes, you really do. Judy put down the phone and went shopping for a new outfit. She selected snug orange bell-bottom pants and an orange and yellow plaid shirt. She thought she looked best in hot colors. A plan emerged for Henry to pick her up at lunchtime on June 12th at her new secretarial job at the Bulgarian tourist office on East 42nd Street in Manhattan, and drive her to Andre's shop in Flatlands. On that morning, she donned her new clothes, added a brown wig with bangs and a white plastic umbrella with matching handbag. Although it was raining, she straddled sunglasses across the top of her head. In Brooklyn, Henry and Judy picked up Joey. Henry and Joey then dropped her off near Andre's shop. She was to walk in and ask about a non-existent car. How will I know who Andre is? He has a mustache, Joey said. He'll have his name on his shirt, Henry said. He's a good-looking guy. How do we know he'll ask me out? Henry and Joey smiled. He will, they said as a chorus. A few blocks away, Judy left Henry's car and sashayed toward Very Best Foreign Car Service. Just inside, she saw Andre on the phone and a young woman behind a desk. The woman, Judy learned later, was Andre's fiancée. Opposed to sex before marriage, the fiancé had reached an understanding with Andre. He could date other women until he and she were married. I'm looking for a white Porsche that my girlfriend left here to be fixed, Judy announced. We don't have a car like that, the woman replied. Judy affected dismay, insisted they must. This caused Andre to put down the phone. Here was a walk-in requiring personal attention. Could I help you? It's my friend's car, a white Porsche. I'm supposed to pick it up. Let me look in the back, Andre smiled. Judy smiled back, pleased her effect was working so soon. Come with me, he said. The garage was small and had only a few cars, none to be mistaken for a white Porsche. Here's my car, Andre said, beaming beside his Mercedes, which she appraised as very nice. He said, maybe the car you're looking for is somewhere else. No, I was told it was here. Well, obviously it isn't, he said. And well, damn, some other friends dropped me off, and I'll have to take a cab, she said. Andre took the bait. Can I drive you home? It isn't any problem. I'll find my way. Well, why don't we get together sometime? Pause. All right, I guess. Do you like to dance? You bet. Well, when? How about tomorrow night? Andre said great. Judy thought he looked like he had just won the lottery. She gave him a phone number a couple of digits off hers and said her name was Barbara. They made plans to meet outside her apartment building on 37th Street. In a strange whirl of shame and triumph, she left the garage and walked to where Henry and Joey waited. "He seems like a nice guy and he's good looking," she wanly said. "I hope you're just going to talk to him." "That's all," Henry said. Judy took the rest of the afternoon off, and the men drove her to her apartment, where Henry took out a vial and laid lines of cocaine, which he and Joey snorted. It was the first time she saw Henry take cocaine. The next day, of Friday the 13th, Henry telephoned Judy and said he would come by her apartment about 7 o'clock that evening and wait outside for Andre. She telephoned Andre to confirm he would meet her in front of her building about 8:30. Excited about his date, Andre left Very Best early that day. He showered the day's grease off and put on brown platform shoes, a white shirt with beige geometric designs, and maroon bell-bottom pants. He topped off the ensemble with a white and red neck scarf and a light pink sweater. Underneath, he was wearing what was described later by a doctor as silk yellow ladies' panties. Traffic into Manhattan was slow, and it was not until 15 minutes after Andre was due that Judy, surveying the street from her 9th-floor window, saw Andre's dark green Mercedes moving slowly east along 37th Street, and then after a right-hand turn, disappearing onto Madison Avenue. In minutes, the car reappeared, probably believing Judy had gone inside because he was late. Andre began to maneuver his car into the only available parking spot, an illegal one by a fire hydrant. Suddenly, a white Lincoln owned by Henry Borelli's father appeared and blocked Andre's car at the curb. 3 men jumped out, surrounded the Mercedes, and flung open its doors. Judy recognized Joey Testa. She also recognized a smaller, wiry man she had seen with Henry once, but knew only as Chris. She did not recognize Anthony Center, whom she had never seen before. Andre got out, but did not try to run. From inside the Lincoln, Judy thought she heard a voice she recognized as Henry's say, "We just want to talk." On the street, she saw Andre hunch his shoulders and extend his arms as if in a shrug. She saw a rope come out and one of the men lift Andre's arms above his shoulders. In another instant, Andre was violently shoved into the Lincoln, which sped away. A wave of guilt knocked Judy Questall onto her couch. She felt jolts of self-hate for her teasing manipulation of Andre and her naivete in trusting Henry. She remained by her window through the night to see if Andre or anyone came for the Mercedes. She was afraid, and in too deep, to do much else. In the morning, police officer Louis Fireberg came upon a mysterious sight, an expensive car parked at an odd angle by a fire hydrant, sunroof up, doors open, leather jacket in plain view in the back seat. In the afternoon, as Judy watched, Andre's beloved car was towed. Her thoughts ran wild, but the truth of his demise was beyond her ken. The 4 kidnappers had driven Andre to Queens. Andre must have begun begging them to kill him as soon as they dragged him into the meat department of a Pantry Pride supermarket, where Roy was waiting. A friend of Roy's had given him access. Roy had told his crew they had to make sure Andre was not seen again. As they all later described it, they had to make him disappear. If his body was found, the police would naturally suspect them. Nino's method had been incineration. The method that former butcher's apprentice Roy was going to use was dismemberment. Dismemberment was not unheard of in the underworld, but even in the mafia it was considered radical, and few had the stomach for it. For Roy, it was going to be just another way to show his power, and so it became that for Chris and Joey and Anthony too. Only Henry had expressed any unease. "I'd shoot anybody for you, Roy, but that, no thanks." "It's just like taking apart a deer," Roy said. "It's only a little weird if you do it while the guy's still alive." The kidnappers had already decided to give Chris his revenge and let him prepare the victim for dismemberment. So as his would-be brothers Joey and Anthony held the quaking victim, and as Roy and Henry watched, Chris furiously drove a long butcher knife into Andre's heart 6 times. The target area was deliberate. The quicker the heart stops pumping, the less bloody mess a victim makes. As Andre slumped to the floor, already dead, Chris maniacally stabbed him 15 times more in the back. Roy and Joey, the second former butcher's apprentice on hand, would now show the others how to dismember a corpse. Out came the boning knives, and on went the white butcher coats and orange and yellow rubber gloves. "We have to wait a little bit," Roy said, "until the blood gets hard." Roy and Joey began stripping the body of its clothes. Chris and Anthony laid out some green plastic garbage bags and twine. Feeling nauseous, Henry went outside, ostensibly to guard a rear exit. Violating his practice of never drinking while working, Roy took occasional shots from a quart bottle of whiskey. So did the others as Roy sliced off the victim's head and he and Joey began sawing the torso apart limb by limb. Chris and Anthony wrapped the body parts in the garbage bags and secured them with the twine. At one point, crazy with personal revenge for the gunshot damage to his face, the bearded Chris took the victim's head and ran it through a machine for compacting cardboard. After the sawing and packaging was over, Henry came back in and everyone methodically cleaned the pantry pride meat department. They swept and mopped the floor, scrubbed the sinks and knives, wiped extruded brain matter off the cardboard compactor. They then took the body parts, Andre's clothes, and the empty whiskey bottle and buried them under some rotten vegetables in a garbage bin behind the store. The Night of Knives marked the real beginning of the DeMeo crew, a union of 5 killing spirits stepping across a wicked threshold. Roy had and would show the way, closely followed by devoted Chris and his loyal brothers, Joey and Anthony. Henry's queasiness hardly exempted him from having become a full partner, and as he would show, he was not at all queasy with guns. It was the coming together of a gang that other gangs would come to fear, and it might have passed officially unrecorded if the killers had not overlooked a detail. The garbage at the supermarket was not picked up on weekends. On Sunday, 2 days later, a bum foraging the garbage bin for food walked off with one of the packages, believing it was a discarded side of beef. Not far away, unwrapping it, he realized his mistake, dropped it, and ran off. In moments, when his dog began barking wildly, a passerby found it and telephoned police. Salvatore Napolitano, the first officer to arrive, went to the garbage bin, unwrapped another package, then quickly summoned a medical examiner, who unwrapped 8 more. At the scene, she laid the body parts on a tarpaulin and pieced them together like a puzzle. The body's genitals were missing and never found. A butcher or someone with knowledge of the anatomy of the human being did this, Detective Michael Walsh told other cops after conferring with the medical examiner. A top police official, Gerald Cairns, told the media there had been a frenzied, wild, vicious type of attack. At the city morgue, Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Dominick DeMeo spoke into a microphone as he began conducting an autopsy. Head is decapitated and flattened into a pancake appearance. Years ago, a branch of the DeMeo family began spelling the name differently. Dr. DeMeo had no reason to know that this horror show it was his duty to review had been directed by his cousin Anthony's son, Roy DeMeo.